On February 5, 2012, a social worker named Elizabeth Griffinhall pulled up to a house in Puyallup, Washington, with 2 young boys in her car. 7-year-old Charlie and 5-year-old Braden Powell were excited. Their father had promised them a surprise. The boys ran ahead to the front door. Josh Powell opened it, grabbed his sons, and slammed the door in Elizabeth's face. She heard the lock click. Then she smelled gasoline. Elizabeth immediately called 911. What happened next would expose one of the most catastrophic failures in Child Protective Services history and lead to a $98 million jury verdict against the state of Washington. But this story doesn't start in 2012. It starts 3 years earlier, when a young mother named Susan Powell vanished from her Utah home. When a government agency made a series of decisions that would ultimately cost 2 children their lives. This is the story of how the system failed Susan Powell's family. Before we go any further, drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from. This case has reached people all over the world, and Susan Powell's family deserves to know how many people are paying attention. Subscribe and turn on notifications because the legal battles in this case continue to this day, and you need to be here when new developments break. Susan Cox Powell was 28 years old when she disappeared on December 6, 2009. She lived in West Valley City, Utah, with her husband Josh and their 2 young sons, Charlie and Braden. On the surface, they looked like a typical young family. Susan worked as a stockbroker at Wells Fargo. Josh worked in computers. They attended church. They had barbecues with neighbors, but behind closed doors, the marriage was falling apart. Susan had confided in friends that Josh was becoming increasingly controlling. He refused to attend church with her. He'd racked up over $200,000 in debt and filed for bankruptcy. He controlled all the finances, even though Susan was the primary breadwinner. Friends described him as possessive, emotionally abusive, and paranoid. In June 2008, 6 months before she disappeared, Susan wrote a secret letter to her family and friends. In it, she stated that there was extreme turmoil in their marriage and that Josh had threatened to destroy her if she filed for divorce. She wrote something that would prove tragically prophetic. If I die, it may not be an accident, even if it looks like one. A month later, she recorded a video of herself walking through their home, documenting all their assets. She stated the date and time clearly. July 29th, 2008, 12:33 p.m. Mountain Time. She said she was covering all her bases in case something happened to her or her family. Susan was preparing to leave Josh. She'd set a deadline. April 6th, 2010, their wedding anniversary. If the marriage didn't improve by then, she was filing for divorce. She never made it to that date. On December 6th, 2009, Susan attended church services with her sons. A friend came over for lunch. Susan made plans for dinner. Around 5 p.m., she said she felt tired and wanted to take a nap. That was the last time anyone outside the household saw Susan Powell alive. The next morning, neither Susan nor Josh showed up for work. The boys weren't dropped off at daycare. Concerned relatives called police for a welfare check. Officers broke into the home, fearing carbon monoxide poisoning. Susan wasn't there, but her purse was. Her wallet, her ID, her keys, her phone, everything was left behind. 2 box fans were positioned in the living room, blowing on a wet spot on the carpet. Around 6:40 p.m. that evening, Josh Powell returned home with Charlie and Braden. He told police he'd taken the boys camping in the middle of the night at Simpson Springs, a remote area in Utah's West Desert. The temperature that night had been below freezing. He claimed Susan had stayed home because she wasn't feeling well. He said he had no idea where his wife was. Police immediately found Josh's story suspicious. He'd taken 2 toddlers camping at midnight in sub-freezing temperatures. He missed work the next morning, but claimed he'd gotten confused about what day it was. He couldn't explain why Susan's phone was in his car with the SIM card removed. When police searched the home, they found blood evidence on the floor near the sofa, later confirmed to be Susan's blood. They also found a handwritten will Susan had hidden in a safety deposit box at her work, along with that prophetic warning. "If I die, it may not be an accident." 4-year-old Charlie told investigators something that contradicted his father's story. He said that Mommy had gone camping with them, but she didn't come back. He said, "My Mommy was in the trunk. Susan Powell's body has never been found." Josh Powell was named a person of interest, but was never arrested. Police believed they knew what happened, but without a body, prosecutors wouldn't file charges. And that's when Josh Powell made a decision that would set a tragedy in motion. He packed up his sons and moved 900 miles away to Puyallup, Washington, to live with his father, Stephen Powell. Now, this is where the story shifts from a missing person case to a systemic failure that would ultimately cost 2 children their lives. Stephen Powell wasn't just Josh's father. He was a documented sexual predator with an obsession with his missing daughter-in-law. When Susan and Josh had briefly lived with Stephen years earlier, Stephen had developed what can only be described as a disturbing fixation on Susan. He secretly filmed her around the house, taking over 4,000 photographs and videos, many zooming in on her body. He kept journals describing his sexual fantasies about her. He stole her underwear. He spied on her in the bathroom using a mirror. In 2003, Stephen had even confessed his feelings to Susan, telling her he was in love with her. Susan rejected him and told Josh, but Josh maintained contact with his father anyway. After Susan disappeared, Stephen publicly supported Josh's claims that Susan had run away with another man. He appeared on television defending his son and attempting to release excerpts from Susan's teenage journals to paint her as mentally unstable. This was the man Josh Powell moved in with, bringing Charlie and Braden along. In August 2011, police executed a search warrant on Stephen Powell's home. What they found was horrifying. In addition to the thousands of images of Susan, investigators discovered voyeuristic images of young neighbor girls, children aged 8 and 10, in various states of undress, photographed through their bathroom window. Stephen had also created folders of images showing himself masturbating to videos of Susan. Stephen Powell was arrested and charged with 14 counts of voyeurism and possession of child pornography. This should have been the moment when Child Protective Services immediately removed Charlie and Braden from that home. Instead, what happened next revealed a system more concerned with parental rights than child safety. Washington State's Department of Social and Health Services, known as DSHS, made a series of decisions that Charlie and Braden's grandparents, Chuck and Judy Cox, would later describe as prioritizing Josh Powell's rights over their grandchildren's lives. Here's what happened. When Stephen Powell was arrested, DSHS did remove the boys from the home. They placed Charlie and Braden with their maternal grandparents, Chuck and Judy Cox, who had been desperately trying to gain custody since Susan disappeared. But here's the critical failure. DSHS didn't terminate Josh's parental rights. Instead, they granted him supervised visitation. Think about that for a moment. Josh Powell was the prime suspect in his wife's disappearance. His children had witnessed something that night, something that made 4-year-old Charlie say, "Mommy was in the trunk." Josh had fled the state with the boys. He'd been living in a house with a man just arrested for child pornography and voyeurism. And the state's response was, you can still see your kids, just with a supervisor present. Chuck and Judy Cox begged DSHS not to allow these visits. They told caseworkers that Josh would kill the children. Judy Cox literally said to them, "He will kill them, he will kill them." DSHS officials told them not to worry. They said they had it covered, they had a supervisor. The caseworkers believed they were working toward reunification, the goal of eventually returning the children to Josh's custody. Despite the fact that their mother was missing and their father was the prime suspect. Judy Cox later recalled a meeting with DSHS officials where she pointed out that the children's mother was missing and they were taking the kids away from her family to give them back to the man suspected of killing her. The DSHS representative responded, "Well, that's not domestic violence. Just because the woman goes missing doesn't mean you take the children away. Let that sink in." According to DSHS, a missing mother wasn't reason enough to deny a father his parental rights. But the failures didn't stop there. In January 2012, during a forensic examination of Josh Powell's computer, investigators found cartoon-style images depicting child sexual abuse and incest. While these weren't photographs of actual children, and therefore not technically illegal, they raised serious red flags about Josh's state of mind. DSHS responded by ordering Josh to undergo a psychosexual evaluation before he could regain custody. This was the moment that sealed Charlie and Braden's fate. Court documents later revealed that Josh Powell knew he was never going to pass that evaluation. He knew his chances of getting his sons back were gone, and rather than lose custody, he decided no one would have them. But even as Josh Powell was planning murder, DSHS continued to grant him supervised visits. On February 1st, 2012, Josh appeared in court for a custody hearing. He was denied the return of his children. 4 days later, DSHS sent a social worker to Josh's rental home with Charlie and Braden for another supervised visit. That social worker's name was Elizabeth Griffin Hall. And what happened that day would expose just how catastrophically DSHS had failed. Elizabeth Griffin Hall had been a contracted supervisor for DSHS for some time. On February 5th, 2012, she picked up Charlie and Braden from their grandparents' home for a scheduled visit with their father. The boys were excited. Josh had told them he had a surprise waiting. They arrived at Josh's rental house around noon. Charlie and Braden ran ahead to the front door. Josh opened it, said, "I've got a surprise for you." I grabbed both boys and slammed the door in Elizabeth's face. She heard the lock click. Elizabeth immediately knew something was wrong. She smelled gasoline. She tried the door, locked. She knocked, shouting for Josh to let her in. No response. She heard one of the children crying inside. Elizabeth ran back to her car and called 911. The call she made is one of the most frustrating and heartbreaking pieces of audio evidence in true crime history. "I'm on a supervised visitation for a court-ordered visit, and something really weird has happened," Elizabeth told the dispatcher. "The kids went into the house, and the parent, the biological parent whose name is Josh Powell, will not let me in." She explained that this had never happened before. She said she could hear one of the kids crying. Then she said the words that should have triggered an immediate emergency response. "I need help right away. I'd like to pull out of the driveway because I smell gasoline and he won't let me in." The 911 dispatcher's response would later become the subject of intense scrutiny. Instead of immediately dispatching police, the dispatcher asked clarifying questions. "What's the address? Who lives there? Are you the one visiting or are you supervising?" Elizabeth, increasingly frantic, explained that she was the supervisor for a court-ordered visit with Josh Powell, the husband of missing Susan Powell. "This is a high-profile case," she said. The dispatcher told her she'd have to wait. Deputies had to respond to emergency, life-threatening situations first. Elizabeth Griffin Hall responded, "This could be life-threatening." The call lasted 6 minutes, but the dispatcher didn't actually send out the call to deputies until 13 minutes had passed from when Elizabeth first dialed 911. By the time police were dispatched, it was too late. Inside the house, Josh Powell had taken his sons to a back bedroom. He'd attacked them with a hatchet, inflicting chopping injuries to their heads and necks. Then, he'd spread gasoline throughout the entire house from 2 5-gallon gas cans he'd purchased and filled earlier that day. He sat down with one gas can between his knees, struck a match, and ignited the house. The explosion was so powerful, it shook neighboring homes. Pieces of insulation rained down on the neighborhood. The fire was visible for blocks. Elizabeth Griffin Hall stood outside, watching the house burn with 2 children inside, knowing she'd done everything she could, and it hadn't been enough. When firefighters finally extinguished the flames, they found 3 bodies. The medical examiner's report revealed the most heartbreaking detail. Charlie and Braden had still been alive when the fire started. Despite the hatchet wounds, they'd survived the attack. They died of carbon monoxide poisoning, inhaling smoke as the house burned around them. They were 7 and 5 years old. Josh Powell had killed his children to avoid losing custody of them, and he'd done it during a state-supervised visit that was supposed to keep them safe. In the aftermath of the murders, Chuck and Judy Cox were destroyed. They'd lost their daughter Susan. Now they'd lost their grandchildren, the only connection they had left to her, and they blamed the state of Washington. The Coxes believed that DSHS had prioritized Josh Powell's parental rights over their grandchildren's safety. They believed the agency had ignored every red flag, dismissed every warning, and continued to facilitate contact between a suspected murderer and his children until it was too late. They filed a wrongful death lawsuit against Washington State's Department of Social and Health Services. The lawsuit alleged that DSHS had been negligent in its handling of the case. Specifically, the Coxes argued that, first, DSHS knew Josh Powell was the prime suspect in his wife's disappearance. Second, DSHS knew the children had been living with a convicted sex offender. Third, DSHS knew Josh's mental state was deteriorating. Fourth, DSHS had been repeatedly warned by family members that Josh would kill the children. And fifth, despite all of this, DSHS continued to grant supervised visits and work toward reunification. The state fought the lawsuit. DSHS officials argued that they had followed proper protocols. They claimed they'd had a supervisor present, that they'd required Josh to rent a separate home for visits, that they'd been working in the children's best interests. But as the case went to trial, the evidence painted a damning picture of an agency more concerned with checking boxes than protecting children. Emails and internal communications revealed that caseworkers had doubts about Josh's fitness as a parent, but felt pressured to work toward reunification. One caseworker had noted concerns about Josh's overbearing behavior with his sons and his underlying narcissistic traits. Another explosive detail emerged. Just days before the murders, a caseworker had called Josh to schedule the supervised visit. The caseworker knew Josh had just been denied custody at the February 1st hearing. The caseworker knew Josh would be required to undergo a psychosexual evaluation, something he was likely to fail given the images found on his computer. And yet, the visit was scheduled anyway. The trial also revealed failures on the day of the murders. Elizabeth Griffin Hall's 911 call was played in court. Jurors heard her increasingly desperate pleas for help. They heard the dispatcher tell her to wait because deputies had to respond to life-threatening emergencies first. Expert witnesses testified that standard protocol for a suspected domestic violence situation, especially one involving a high-profile murder suspect, should have been an immediate emergency response. The 13-minute delay between Elizabeth's initial call and the dispatch to deputies became a central point of the case. Could police have arrived in time to save the children? We'll never know. But the jury heard testimony suggesting that those critical minutes might have made the difference. The lawsuit also examined broader systemic issues within DSHS. The Cox's attorneys argued that the agency had a pattern of prioritizing parental rights over child safety, even in cases where parents were clearly dangerous. They presented evidence of other Washington state cases where DSHS had returned children to abusive parents with tragic results. They argued that the agency's culture valued reunification above all else, even when reunification meant putting children at risk. In November 2013, after hearing weeks of testimony, the jury reached a verdict. They found Washington State's Department of Social and Health Services negligent in the deaths of Charlie and Braden Powell. The jury awarded the estates of Charlie and Braden Powell $98 million in damages. It was one of the largest wrongful death verdicts against a state agency in American history. The breakdown: $1 million to each child for the pain and suffering they endured before death. $96 million in economic damages, representing the value of their lost lives, the careers they would never have, the families they would never raise. Chuck and Judy Cox stood outside the courthouse after the verdict and spoke to reporters. Chuck said, "We didn't do this for the money. We did this so that this never happens to another family." Judy added, "Charlie and Braden deserved better. Susan deserved better. And we're going to make sure their deaths meant something." But the legal battle wasn't over. Washington State immediately moved to reduce the verdict. Under state law, there are caps on damages that can be awarded against government agencies. A judge ultimately reduced the $98 million verdict to $32 million, still an enormous sum, but far less than the jury had intended. The state also appealed, arguing that DSHS couldn't be held liable for Josh Powell's actions. They claimed that Josh, not the agency, was responsible for the murders. The Cox family fought back. Their attorneys argued that while Josh pulled the trigger, the state had loaded the gun by continuing to facilitate contact between a dangerous man and vulnerable children. As of the legal filings, the case has gone through multiple appeals. The state and the Cox family have been locked in litigation for years over the final amount to be paid and whether DSHS should be held liable at all. But regardless of how the legal battle ends, the case has already created meaningful change. In June 2014, Tennessee Governor Bill Haslam signed 2 laws named after crime victims. One of them was called the Chris Newsom Act, after another tragic case. But advocates for the Cox family pushed for similar reforms in Washington and Utah. The case led to several significant policy changes. First, supervised visitation protocols. Many states strengthened requirements for supervised visitation in cases involving suspected violence. Supervisors are now trained to recognize danger signs and have authority to immediately terminate visits if they sense risk. Second, prioritizing child safety over parental rights. The case became a rallying cry for advocates arguing that Child Protective Services had become too focused on reunification and not focused enough on safety. Several states revised their guidelines to explicitly state that child safety must be the primary consideration. Third, 911 dispatcher training. The failure of the 911 response led to reforms in emergency dispatch protocols. Dispatchers received additional training on recognizing high-risk domestic violence situations and understanding that supervised visits can still be dangerous. Fourth, background checks for household members. Some jurisdictions strengthened requirements that all household members, not just parents, undergo background checks before children can be placed in a home. This was directly related to the fact that Charlie and Braden had been living with their grandfather, Stephen, a convicted sex offender. Fifth, risk assessment tools, child protective services. Agencies began implementing more sophisticated risk assessment tools that consider the totality of circumstances, not just whether specific legal standards have been met. Perhaps most importantly, the case became a teaching tool in social work programs across the country. It's now studied as an example of how systemic failures, bureaucratic inertia, and an overemphasis on process over safety can have catastrophic consequences. But for Chuck and Judy Cox, no amount of legal victories or policy changes could bring back what they'd lost. In interviews over the years, they've spoken about the life sentence they're serving. Susan has been missing since 2009, 15 years as of 2024. Her body has never been found. Charlie and Braden are gone. Josh is dead. His brother Michael, who police believed helped dispose of Susan's body, died by suicide in 2013. Susan Powell died in 2018 after his release from prison. Everyone who might know what happened to Susan is dead. The Cox family continues to push for Susan to be legally declared dead with the cause listed as homicide. They've advocated for continued searches of mine shafts in Utah's West Desert, where they believe Josh disposed of Susan's body. They've also worked to keep Susan's story alive, doing media interviews and speaking at advocacy events. Because for them, this isn't just about legal reform or jury verdicts. It's about making sure the world remembers Susan Powell, Charlie Powell, and Braden Powell. The $98 million verdict against Washington State's Department of Social and Health Services sent a clear message. Government agencies can be held accountable when their failures cost lives. But the bigger question remains, did it change anything? Child Protective Services agencies across the country still struggle with the same tensions that plagued DSHS in 2012. They're understaffed, underfunded, and caught between competing priorities. Parents' rights versus children's safety. Reunification versus permanent separation. Caseworkers make impossible decisions every day with incomplete information and inadequate resources. And when they get it wrong, children die. The Susan Powell case stands as a stark reminder of what can happen when systems prioritize process over people, when warning signs are ignored, and when the adults in the room fail to protect the most vulnerable among us. Susan Powell has been missing for over 15 years. Her sons have been gone for 12 years. Their story should have ended differently. A mother should have been able to leave a dangerous marriage safely. 2 children should have been protected by the agency tasked with their welfare. A family should not have been destroyed by preventable failures. That $98 million verdict can't bring them back, but it stands as a testament to their lives and a warning about the cost of failure. If you want to honor Susan, Charlie, and Braden Powell, share this video. Make sure their story is told. Make sure people understand that this wasn't just about one bad actor. It was about a system that failed at every level. And if you work in child protective services, if you're a caseworker or a supervisor or an administrator, remember their names. Remember what happens when agencies forget that their first duty is to protect children, not parental rights. Susan Powell, Charlie Powell, Braden Powell. Their names deserve to be remembered.